Uh, so I think about this often because from the moment she went missing and her disappearance was investigated, and then later her death, I get asked about this a lot, and I will also say, I was one of many people at the bookstore who was working at the time that she came in. Um, but she was very outgoing, I think, in a way that felt overwhelming and even possibly aggressive to some people, because she was going up to folks and talking to them, asking questions about everything from, their recommendations for books and music to places she should visit and how she could get there because she was a visitor using public transportation. Um, and for me, as another young woman, I was in my 20s at the time. I think I was, I don't know, 5 or 6 years older than her. And I also traveled by myself. There was a little bit of me that was like, oh, I get this. Like, you're on your own, you're feeling a little adrift in a new city, and you want to find people to connect with. But I also know that there are aspects of that certainly read. And I think it was the fact that she was asking so many questions and engaging with so many people that made her memorable to me and a number of other people who were in the store at the time. I at our heyday when I was still at the last bookstore, we would see hundreds, if not thousands, of people a day, and the fact that she was so gregarious made it easy for me to remember her, and remember what our interaction was like. Yeah, in the moment, it was just, a slightly odd duck, which I connected with as somebody who is often, I don't know, I was the weird kid in school. So I was like, I get it. I'm like, yeah, you're in a new place. You want to connect with somebody. You're feeling alone. Like, yeah, you're asking questions. And, I did not have a negative experience of meeting her. I was like, oh, I see somebody else who's, trying to make some connection in a new place on her own. And so I guess empathy, compassion, and I hope that came through. Like, I think about that a lot too, that aspect of possibly being one of the last people that she actually interacted with, and hoping that in whatever those last hours of her life that she did not feel
Judge.
yeah, or just as like alone or invisible as I think could have happened, dying in mysterious circumstances in a place that wasn't home. And I also I always make this a point of any interview I do. Like, one of the things we talked about and why she, kind of stuck in my head and why I continue to say yes sometimes to interviews is that multiple times in our conversation, she was asking a lot about like the weight of what she had and whether or not she would need to ship things home, or if she could still like put it all in her suitcase and fly with the weight, because she was buying things to take home to her family, to her sister specifically, and knowing that she was thinking about them, planning to go back to them, you know, clearly like the gift giving, I'm like, that feels like a very loving action. And so if I was in a similar situation and someone could tell my sister that I had been thinking of her and talking about her and planning to get back to her, like, I would want to know that. So there's there's a lot of humanity to her, and I think a lot of times certainly a lot of what has happened over the years is she's just become a mysterious figure. There were lots of conspiracy theories, but for my lived experience, she was a girl I met on her travels who cared about her family and was planning to get back to them.
You make a very important point because you fill in some of the gaps that perhaps have been very painful to the family. Not only was she thinking of them, she was planning a future.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that make you feel as an individual to be able to maybe fill in some of those gaps?
Uh, a small sense of responsibility. I have no insight into the investigation, into how she ended up where she ended up. But as someone who has lost loved ones to suicide, um, I you know I want to be able to issue some comfort, and there still feels to me like some sort of compelling argument that usually people who are planning to kill themselves are getting rid of possessions. They are not making plans for the future. So the fact that she was kind of doing the opposite has always raised questions in my mind, but knowing that she cared about the people in her life, that she had plans, that she was expecting to go home to them, has always felt like something I've never wanted to seek out her family. I have a feeling that if I get inundated with questions and messages from strangers and I am so tangentially related, how much more must they get? And I don't want to add to that. But if I can put out in a very accessible way that she cared about them, that she loved them, I'm like, that is really the driving factor behind why I ever say yes to interviews, because I want her family to know that she still loved them and thought of them even in those last days of her life.
This case goes all the way back to 2013 when she was discovered. All these years later, and of course this new Netflix series that just came out, why the fascination with this case, with this hotel, with this period of time?
Well, I think the hotel, the fascination there is that it has so many difficult and painful and gruesome things connected with it. And then I think, certainly as I've thought about it, it feels like we shouldn't still have this kind of unsolved mystery in an era of security cameras and cell phones and tracking. And I think anytime something happens where we say, oh, all of these mechanisms of how we record the world, how we protect ourselves, they still fail. There are still gaps. And so I think that sense of how, in this day and age, in a major city, in such a densely packed part of it, how is there no other information about, how she got to the roof, how she got in the water tank? I think a lot of that continues to pull on people's imaginations. I think unfortunately there was a lot of sort of conspiracy elements that got caught up in it. The fact that there was a TB outbreak on Skid Row at the same time, and the name of the strain or the treatment or something, had strong similarities to her own name, led to lots of people theorizing that she wasn't real, or she, was an agent of this. And I'm like, I met her. She was a real human being who had a real life and whose family and friends have now for years mourned this loss and continued to have people want to talk about it and theorize about it. So, I think it's a lot of disparate pieces that come together to create this enduring fascination with that moment.
I'm sure you looked at the video that exists online having to do with her looking so lost and distraught in the elevator. And when you look at that video, what comes to mind?
I saw it when it first came out, and I've seen glimpses of it since, but it's it's distressing to know that whether or not there was somebody outside of that elevator to whom she is reacting, she is clearly in distress, afraid, upset, and whether that came from an external source or she was the victim of her own brain acting against her, whatever it is, knowing that she was in such a state toward the end of her life is upsetting. Yeah, knowing that was a big part of how she felt in that moment. It's gut-wrenching, it's heartbreaking, and so I don't, usually when I see it pop up on something, I'm like, and I don't need to see that again, thank you.
Right. And just two last questions.
Sure.
Your final thoughts, and then also I'm curious, what did she buy when she was there?
Okay. My final thoughts are, that it would be really nice to know definitively what happened. I know there are lots of theories. I know that the new Netflix series posits a conclusion as well. But I think it's okay to live with the unknowing, and that whatever brings the people that actually knew her in life a sense of peace and closure is what we should embrace. And I'm like, that feels slightly weird to be like, I am here talking about it on the news when part of my conclusion is it would be okay for us to let this go so that her family doesn't have to be reminded of this all the time. Yeah, and that at the heart of any sort of unsolved mystery like this, there are actual human beings, and their absence from the world has very real effect on the people who knew them and loved them, and that it's easy for us to watch, true crime or unsolved mystery type shows and get caught up in sort of the, fervor and mystery and forget that these were real lives and that their loss had real impact on their actual communities. And then certainly, from my perspective, like as somebody who was in customer service and suddenly was faced with the idea that, the interactions I may have in a day could be the last human interaction that somebody else has, and and also having regular customers who passed away from natural causes, but realizing there's a responsibility that we individually have to meet others with kindness and compassion, because in the same way that I think a lot of people who have dealt with loss, now end every conversation with loved ones with, I love you, because they want that to be the last thing that someone hears. I'm like, I hope that in all of this, like, we bear in mind, we don't know what other people are going through. We don't know what will happen to them as soon as we leave each other's company. And so how do we, in those moments we have, whether it's with strangers or loved ones, I don't know, show kindness? Lots of final thoughts there. And then to your last question, I could not at this point tell you any of the titles that she purchased. I do remember her buying a lot. It was like, a banker's box worth of books and records. And from our conversation, it sounded like a good half of those were intended to be gifts to people when she returned home. So, sorry, I can't remember book titles or album titles. But that's what I remember.
But clearly thinking of others in her final moments.
Yeah.